Welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Hi everyone and welcome once again to the SportsPro podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor at large at SportsPro. Very happy to be back with you once more. We're moving on today to the second part of our SportsPro 50mm trilogy. And this time we're going to be looking at the most marketed brands in the world of sport across social platforms, trying to get a sense of which brands have received the most value and the broadest exposure from their partnerships with athletes, teams, and competitions over the past 12 months. This is a project we've been working on with Hookit, and it's powered by their sport graph and computer vision technology, which assesses sponsorship value by tracking the social activity of every major professional athlete, team, and league across 500,000 accounts. Hookit also examined potential value and promotion quality, multiplying those metrics together to determine a discounted adjusted ad value. All very involved stuff, so it's definitely for the best that we have Scott Tilton, who is the co-founder and chief executive of Hookit, back on the podcast to talk us through it all. Scott and I also discuss some of the key trends that emerge from the list, what it tells us about which brands are promoting themselves most effectively, and what their priorities are, the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, and wider social phenomena like the Black Lives Matter movement, how social marketing has changed, and how it will continue to change. A reminder that you can find the full list as well as a heavy dose of excellent supporting editorial for all three 50mm projects, including the most marketable athletes, and from Monday, the 12th of October, SportsPro's first ever list of the world's most marketable sports properties. You can find all of that stuff over at 50mm.sportspromedia.com. So loads to get through there. Much more coming up as well from the world of SportsPro. The SportsPro Insider Series continues with a look at leadership on Wednesday, the 14th of October. We've got some fascinating sessions lined up, so go ahead and register at sportsproinsiderseries.com if you haven't, for some reason, done so already. You can also get access to hours and hours of sessions from throughout 2020 on demand. And while you're at it, you should register as well for SportsPro Asia. That's our next big virtual conference, and it's happening on the 21st and 22nd of October. sportsproasia.com for all the details there. Right now, though, we're talking about sports' most marketed brands, and we're talking about them with Hookit's Scott Tilton.
This is the SportsPro podcast.
Scott Tilton, co-founder and chief executive of Hookit. Welcome back to the SportsPro podcast.
Thanks, Owen. Good to be here.
Great to have you back, and great to be talking about our latest joint project, which is the 50 most marketed brands. It's our first time we've had a bash at this list. I think it gives a really useful overview of what's going on in sports sponsorship and marketing generally, or what has been going on over the last year. I think it gives us lots of jumping off points for what is going to happen, obviously, in what's going to be a transformed sector in the year ahead, and possibly beyond that. But all of that to come. First of all, Scott, obviously, you guys have been working on the data and the methodology of this list, which we will move on to in just a sec. But what was the basis of it? First of all, what's it trying to demonstrate? What's the solution that it's offering?
Yeah, I think when we first got into the data and analytics business, and the real problem that we were trying to solve was to help provide some visibility into how much value brands were getting from their sponsorships and social media. When we first started this, everyone was still primarily basing the value of their sponsorship deals on television ratings and viewership, on-site exposure, more traditional media metrics, and social media in the meantime was just exploding. And no one was effectively really quantifying what was coming from it. So as part of this project, we essentially tracked the entire sport ecosystem, so every professional athlete, team, league, event property, and looked at how much value was being generated from all of their social posts for brands. And what we looked at was about 7,000 brands were tracked. And we looked at the time frame from last August, so August 1st, 2019 through July 31st, 2020, and wanted to get a full year view of just how much value is generated from the sport ecosystem for these 7,000 brands. And the platforms that we looked at were Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. And we just found some kind of really interesting insights of what was going on out there. So I think one of the kind of critical things, especially this year with COVID, was that when events got put on hold, it really put a lens and hyper focus on the importance of social, because that was really the only platform to activate these sponsorships with no events going on. Granted, COVID had a little bit of an impact where there wasn't a lot of expectation by brands, but needless to say, the value that was generated was extraordinary, and happy to run through it today.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the list has been ordered by the value received by brands who are active in the sports industry. Won't be too much of a surprise for people to learn that Nike, Emirates Airlines, and Adidas are the top three. But how does the methodology work, and how did you develop it?
Yeah, so it's a cost per engagement valuation model, and it's also an adjusted ad value model. So what we look for, so what we're scouring all of these posts. So we're looking at every photo and video, in some cases Instagram stories, and we analyze for promotion of brands via text-based promotion. So it's keywords, hashtags, mentions, tags, and then also for visual promotion as well. So we're looking for logos within photos and videos. So our methodology is set up in a way where we have the ability to basically downweight the overall value based on the quality of the promotion. And so we start with a max ad value. So we use actual executed rates based on what brands and agencies are spending on social campaigns. And then we downweight it based on the promotion quality, or the quality of the promotion. So we look at things like size and clarity of logos. We look at competition and crowding. So is it a deliberate post where a single brand is being promoted, or is it incidental promotion where there's multiple brands being promoted? So all of those things get taken into account, as well as the timing of the exposure within videos, to downweight to an adjusted ad value.
Mm.
And so when you look at the top line numbers, so the max ad value for the top 50 was a little over $10 billion, but then the downweighted value is 3 billion. And the interesting part was that the top 10 drove nearly a little over 50% of the overall value for the top 50. So the top 10 generated 1.6 billion in adjusted ad value. So it's clearly it's a tops down where the top 10 are generating a lion's share of the overall value.
And how is it that you settled on that as being the most effective way of doing this?
So we're very brand focused. We work with large global brands, and we've really been focused on making sure that we have a realistic model that is palatable for brands. And when we first started doing the valuation model, it was very much more of an earned media value, where we were looking at rate card, and the feedback that we got from brands was that that wasn't a realistic view of what this content was worth based on the engagement. It felt too inflated, and so we revamped the model to something that was just far more realistic. So we start with actual executed rates and then downweight it, and it's been just much more well received by the brands that we work with, because it's they can actually use it now as a better gauge of what this exposure and engagement is worth in social.
Yeah, and what does this process tell us about how the measurement of sponsorship and marketing data has evolved in this context?
It's absolutely gotten much more data driven. So I think the interesting thing is that in the past it was much more gut feel, and you could put intangible values on different assets. And I think now everyone is getting to a place where they want it to be more data driven, much more realistic and accurate, and also more real time. So I think because social is so fluid, it gives you the ability to really measure and monitor and optimize on the fly to get the most out of your partnerships. And but yeah, so I think what COVID did this year was it just if brands weren't hyper focused on holding partners accountable and really evaluating what they're trying to accomplish, that accelerated everything with everything that went on this year to make sure that they're getting the most of their investments in really difficult times.
Let's go into the list itself. Obviously, we've talked about the top three, and a lot of the other usual suspects are in there somewhere. Monster Energy and Red Bull just in behind. Puma also up there in the top 10. AB InBev and Gatorade, Coca Cola, Allianz, all the people you would expect, but perhaps not all in the order that you might expect them. But what was the prevailing trend that you identified while you were drawing this list up?
Yeah, so we looked at if you look at the just even the top 20, so 19 of the top 20, with the exception of State Farm, are heavily invested in global football and or motorsports. So State Farm kind of made the cut because they got huge numbers from their partnership with the NBA, and then the other kind of element was some of the brands with large athlete programs. So you've got Monster Energy and Red Bull, who are so broad. They're heavily focused on athlete programs. They've got really strong content strategies, but then they're also involved with teams and leagues and event properties. So they're just a very diverse portfolio. And then you've got some that are just heavily invested in global football, and they've got massive value from a limited number of partnerships. So that was kind of the first big one, was that there was, the category focus was global football, and motorsports was the two kind of primary categories that drove a lot of the value for these brands. And then if you look at more from a product categories perspective, 35 of the top 50 were from, apparel and accessories, and, including fashion, shoes, watches. Automotive was in there, and then obviously beverage. So not just the energy or soft drink companies, but also alcohol. And then financial services were in there as well. So 35 of the top 50 were from those four categories. But yeah, again, as I mentioned earlier, it's very like top heavy, so when you look at the top 10, of the overall adjusted ad value that was generated is just over $3 billion. More than half of it came from the top 10. So it's really interesting to see just how much value those top 10 are getting. And the interesting part is that they're not all the biggest spenders in sports sponsorship either. They're just very effective at getting value from the partnerships that they do have.
Yeah.
When you look at some of the top spenders like Verizon and Molson Coors and FedEx and Microsoft or Bank of America, all of them, according to IAG, are spending 75 million on sponsorship or more. They didn't make the top 50.
So what does that tell us about which brands are working most effectively in this list? I mean, are there case studies that you would pull from the list that perhaps demonstrate this?
Yeah, I think it's the brands that are on the list clearly have made social a kind of core pillar of their strategy. So there's an expectation, or at least part of their strategy is, how do we leverage these partnerships in social to engage new fans and new consumers. So some of those other brands that I just mentioned, they may or may not even have social as a primary component of their sponsorship, deals and strategies. So yeah, again, because we're so focused on the social side of things, all of this value in these top 50 brands that were evaluated, it's all based on what their partners are doing for them in social media. So I think moving forward, social will continue to become a core pillar to these brand sponsorship strategies in order to engage new consumers.
Yeah. So I mean, obviously there are going to be brands, and you mentioned a couple of them, Microsoft, for example, who might be making more of a B2B play through their sponsorship anyway. So perhaps it's the demonstration of capability might be more important than direct outreach through social media.
Yep. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think, there's sponsorship is comes in a lot of different forms. So it's not necessarily a bad thing if their strategy is B2B, then, attracting new consumers on social media may or may not be on the radar or even a priority. So no, that's exactly right. It all depends on, what is their strategy and what's their ultimate objective. And if social and reaching new consumers is a primary one, social media is a very critical component to the overall equation.
No, I mean you've touched on this a little bit in terms of when you were identifying some of the brands who are on the list, and how, for example, Monster and Red Bull's strategy might diverge from someone like Standard Chartered. But what are some of the different approaches that you were able to kind of divine from the data that you were examining?
Nike clearly is doing a lot of things right. They also have a huge portfolio. So when we looked at the data, one of the big elements was how many different how many different entities were promoting these brands. So it wasn't just the overall value, but it was also the sheer number of entities that were promoting. So when you look at the top 10, Nike had nearly 12,000 different entities promote them in the last 12 months. So that's athletes, teams, leagues, event properties. So they were by far the number one promoted brand just by the sheer number of people promoting them. But then you look down at like Standard Charter, for example, number 8 on the list. They had the lowest number of entities promoting them, so only 378, and they were still able to generate nearly $80 million in adjusted ad value. Nike by far, was they drove about $460 million in adjusted ad value from those 12,000 promoters. But yeah, they clearly just were, more than double, their rival Adidas.
Yeah, what does that tell us about what Standard Chartered are doing?
Yeah, so it's there's another kind of relevant example, but I think they're probably more heavily invested in, on the team side of things, where Nike clearly has a very large athlete program. Another kind of similar example that jumped out was New Balance, which is number 37 on the list. They received 30% more value than their rival Under Armour, but Under Armour had 50% more people or entities promoting them. So the average value per partner was significantly higher for New Balance than it was for Under Armour. Um, you know, so I think a lot of it comes down to the effectiveness of how well are these brands working with their partners to make sure that their expectations are clear, their content strategies are clear, and just really optimizing what they're getting from their partners. So that we spend a lot of time with our brand partners on how can we more effectively work with these athletes, teams, and leagues to make sure that they're doing what we need them to do in social.
And just to, I guess, differentiate again between, there are brands that have event properties that they're associated with and teams, and then there are brands who are more heavily affiliated with athletes. Now, one of the things that we hear about a lot with social is that it gravitates towards the individual. So even though it's possible for an organization to gain a pretty substantial following and quite an engaged one, there are always going to be a cohort of individuals who are going to have a little bit more of a kind of organic feeling connection with their audiences, or they potentially have a better chance of that. If you're a brand and that's what you're faced with, how do you differentiate those two strategies between one where if you are going to be working heavily with athletes and one where you're going to be working heavily either with teams or with competitions?
Yeah, the and I wouldn't necessarily agree with it. It's an athlete first strategy with social, because the teams and leagues have the same potential to drive massive engagement, and most of them do. When you look at the number one, like the largest in the last 12 months was the NBA in terms of how much engagement they were able to generate in social. So the same model applies, though. I think you just have more opportunities with athletes because there's so many more of them, and but I think the strategies are still the same. So working with an athlete or a team or a league, it might require a slightly different strategy in terms of your content, but the same rules apply, which is you have complete control over how, whether it's an athlete, team, or league, how they want to communicate with their fans and their followers. You can collaborate with them on the content that's being produced and distributed, whereas you don't have that type of control, when it comes to traditional media like television. The only real way that you can do it is through, advertising and other things, but you can't literally sit down and collaborate with, a team and figure out how to, get content on the TV. So, so social just gives you a much more fluid ability to control your outcome and your own destiny. But the strategy, whether you're working with athletes or with teams or with leagues, is all pretty similar. It's just you need to collaborate and really focus on what content works and how do I get my message across, and just working with your partners to do that.
And in terms of that content, what have we seen in terms of what drives engagement? Is it about conversation? Is it about incentive? Is it about, well, how do you what's some of the best practice there that brands working through sponsored content that as it might be promoted or it might be appearing on a club or a player's channels kind of organically or what have you, but how do you drive engagement and how do you drive interest in that content?
Yeah, so that's kind of the exciting part is that it's also the most complex part was that it actually varies from partner to partner. So as an overarching theme, we find that video definitely is drives more engagement than still images. But when you start getting into like looking at individual athletes, so looking at Ronaldo, for example, we did a full analysis on what types of his content generates the most engagement, and family was number one, and lifestyle was number two. His on-field and like product promoted was at the bottom of the list.
Mm.
So and then when we were looking at like motorsports athletes, and it was their off the track content that was generating more engagement than their actually on the track content. So I think one of the themes there is I think that fans want to see like who are these people like off the field, and what do they do, and what's their personality. So I think but the interesting part is that it does vary depending on who the athlete or who the team or the league is, because it's everyone's a little bit different.
Yeah, so I guess it comes down these two things. I guess they sound counterintuitive, but they're not. Which is that when it comes to social media, it comes down to kind of authenticity, but also analysis at the same time. So you're thinking, all right, what is there about this team or this individual that connects with people, but also we actually have to have some kind of granular understanding of who their audience is and what they actually respond to.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think not only the actual types of content, but then you can also look at, time of week and time of day, like when are fans engaging the most, and then also the platform. So, for athletes, the dominant platform is Instagram. That isn't necessarily true for teams and leagues. Like Facebook is still, a pretty big go-to platform. But yeah, so you have to look at all those different variables to figure out how to really turn the dials and optimize your strategy as best as possible.
Just to turn that around, I mean, was that something that also was reflected in different types of brands? So certain brands are going to perform better on certain platforms, or did it come down more to the content and who they were associated with?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. I think, yeah, we didn't actually provide the platforms that were generating the most value, but it was just top line value. But yeah, it's a combination of both. It's who are they associated and partnered with, and then what are those partners doing on which platforms, and just how much content. Because when you look at the top 10 again, Nike generated over 5.5 billion engagements on the posts that those nearly 12,000 people made. So there's just massive numbers on there, and that doesn't include video views.
Mm.
So you can imagine just kind of the scale of the impact and the engagement that they're getting.
I guess the other thing from the perspective of some of these brands is that they become channels unto themselves as well. If you Nike would be the most obvious example, but the two energy drinks brands that are in there too have. Is that going to be a part of a brand sponsor's content strategy that if you can develop a tone of voice, then that also is productive on this kind of scale?
Yeah, because I think you can look at your all of your partners and their collective following as it's just extending your reach and the ability to become we always look at, and we work with our partners to really just educate them that they really are their own media properties. So when you start getting these massive followings, like Ronaldo has over 450 million followers now, there's no network that can match that. So there's and that's just one athlete. So granted, he's on a completely kind of different scale than a lot of the other athletes out there, but when you just look at the potential and scale of what is possible with social, it's kind of mind blowing. So I think when you start building a portfolio then of athletes, teams, and leagues, and looking at that collective reach and the collective followings, it just becomes extremely massive very quickly, and which is what makes it exciting and also complicated to really properly go out and leverage to get the most value as possible.
Join the conversation with the Sports Pro community. Follow us on Twitter at SportsPro. Find us on Instagram at sportspro.media. And connect to Sports Pro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. Sports Pro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
You talked about it a little bit towards the top, but it's obviously something you're working from home, I'm working from home. It's the topic that is in the background of almost anything that you're going to be discussing this year. And you mentioned that obviously there's going to be a drift towards social as a result of the pandemic and as a result of other promotional channels and other promotional avenues being closed, particularly in person for any kind of sponsors. What kind of impact can we detect from the COVID-19 pandemic in this data?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting year. I think we did a panel together a couple of months ago and reviewed all of the trends from COVID, and not just COVID, but also the kind of racial inequality issues that have been going on, across the globe. But so yeah, what we saw with COVID was it it increased the kind of awareness and focus on social as a platform to activate sponsorships when events were shut down. But at the same time, between the months of really March and June, um, overall engagement and value kind of fell off a cliff because there was not much of an expectation from brands for their partners to do anything. There was just so much going on that there's so many other bigger issues going on that sponsorship value wasn't really high on the priority list, if you will. But yeah, so the value did drop between March and June, but by July, when sports did start coming back, granted without fans and stands, the engagements and the values returned to kind of pre-pandemic levels, if you will. One of the interesting things, though, is really on the Olympic side of things. Is that if you look at all the TOP sponsors for the Olympics, only two actually made the top 50. So it was Coca-Cola and Toyota that made the list, and the rest didn't even make the cut. And I think that would have been different if the games had gone on. And so I think keeping an eye on next year, the list should get shaken up a little bit with the return of the Olympics.
Yeah, absolutely. But I guess as well that also reflects, some of how that program has shifted to not just include mass consumer brands like Coca-Cola, and it now incorporates more technical sponsors who are kind of supplying the games on the digital side of things at scale.
Yeah, exactly. Or oftentimes these brands will align with athletes, and they'll get their kind of pop, in an Olympic year, and that opportunity just didn't exist this year.
It's an interesting point that you make in bringing in kind of the conversation around Black Lives Matter and the impact that made through the summer and continues to make. To an extent, it ties together a little bit with what happened in the earliest stages of COVID too, when it was a difficult time to communicate and there were difficult issues to communicate about. Particularly if you're looking at something from a corporate perspective or a brand perspective. We're kind of covering ground again that, as you mentioned, we talked about in the Insider series a little bit earlier this year. But what were some of the most sensible approaches that you saw brands taking in approaching those kind of issues where you needed a degree of sensitivity, you needed a degree of humanity and authenticity as well?
Yeah, it's so when we did in that last panel that we had done together, we reviewed some of the stats that came out of it, and we were just out of sheer curiosity wanted to understand what was the industry actually doing to like respond to the movement. And the surprise in the whole thing was that it really was a large portion of the industry didn't do anything. So when we did an analysis of looking at brands, athletes, teams, leagues, um, is brands, athletes, and leagues, less than 25% even posted about the movement. And teams were the most active, and I think it was around 44%. But for when you look at those kind of stats, the lion's share of the industry was pretty silent on the matter. And I think there's a couple of kind of key reasons behind that. Is most people, I think, were just afraid of doing the wrong thing, because it did feel like, for the ones that did make an effort to speak out and have a voice, it was kind of met like with 50-50 split of people in favor and people criticizing them. So it was kind of one of those things that it's really hard to do the right thing. And when you looked at sports coming back in one of the early NFL games here in the states, when they did take a stand, and just a moment of silence, it was met with boos. So it's just a very sensitive topic, and it's very hard to do the right thing, even if you're trying.
Yeah, is it fair to say you have to earn the right to be able to talk to people on those terms and about those kind of issues? That it can't be something that you just kind of you see a movement passing by and you attach yourself to it. It has to actually reflect something about who you are.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it, because you can't just say something once because it's going on. It's something that has to be kind of more part of your culture and DNA, at least as an organization. And I think that's one of the things that's come out of this, is that you've you've seen, and we're definitely way off topic of the social side of things, but I think what we're seeing with brands is that a lot of them are kind of revisiting their core values, and making this part of their ongoing voice, and just who they are as an organization, so that it's not something that you just jump on a bandwagon and support when because something bad happened.
I guess it's important in a social context as well, because that is your direct route of communication with your potential customers, which is why it's just an interesting context to put it in. And it's again, it's the topic of racial justice is one, and I think you're right that lots of brands have reflected upon themselves and the way that they act. But I think the other one is COVID more generally. I think there's a lesson there in that one of the jokes I saw quite maybe kind of April May time, as you started to see brand communication coming back into the picture, was now more than ever, we want you to feel free to buy our product. So there is a kind of tonal thing that you have to get right there, and it does have to it's got to come from somewhere real, basically. Obviously everybody's got to get back to work, but I just think it's an interesting lesson in how new media acts.
This year, is has just been a extremely challenging year for a variety of different reasons, and it'll just be interesting to see how things start to return to normal, and just how the industry bounces back too, because I think
Mm.
everything is kind of forever changed. We're watching games on television with no fans, and like everyone's pivoting strategies to operate in a new normal right now.
What advice are you giving clients at the moment about how to get through this period? Because obviously everything has changed. We don't know how lasting some of that change is going to be. We don't know where we're seeing trends that are going to persist when we get back to something more like, let's call it a freer life rather than normality. But obviously you work in an area where you're doing a lot of measurement and you're doing a lot of reactive work as well as building strategy. So what's the balance that you're advising clients to strike there?
Yeah, so we're you know I wouldn't want to call it downtime, but but in a time when things aren't really getting done, or it's just there's a lot of uncertainty right now. So our kind of big piece of feedback is take a step back and use this time as an opportunity to adjust strategies, adjust expectations, really collaborate with your partners, and just evaluate, are you getting what you need out of these investments? And but yeah, so use this time to just strategize on how things can be improved moving forward, because I think before the pandemic, if brands weren't data focused or data minded, if they weren't in heavy evaluation mode, or scrutinizing their investments, or really scrutinizing the accountability of their partners, COVID just fast tracked all of that. And so I think now we're finding that a lot of the brands are in that mindset. They're forced to have to evaluate everything because they're struggling with, shrinking budgets, and so I think it's a really good time to just kind of right size things, and just make sure that these partnerships are really well aligned, and that there's accountability built into every one of these deals now. And I think that's kind of what we're seeing, and how we're collaborating with our brand partners on how to adjust things, and just tighten things up moving forward.
What else does the list tell us about sports sponsorship and marketing in 2020? What are some of the trends that you've identified that are not temporary ones that are going to outlast this and that people need to be aware of in the longer term?
Yeah, I think probably the biggest one is just that social is here to stay. I think when you look at, granted, there was a dip in March through June, but with everything, it has kind of returned to kind of pre-pandemic levels, and it's actually increasing year over year. So from a platform perspective, the value is relatively consistent with last year, despite everything going on in the world. You can't say the same thing about traditional media and television. And so I think it's just really shined a light on just how powerful social media is and why it has to be a core component of these brand strategies moving forward.
Yeah, and how else are we going to see the sector changing? What trends have we either seen accelerated, or should we be looking out for over the horizon in the next couple of years or so?
Yeah, I think we continue to kind of wave this flag, and it's really, actually, you're starting to see it now in day-to-day conversations. But I think everything is going to become much more metrics driven. There's going to become more standardized KPIs that brands are using to evaluate their partnerships, apples to apples. They're going to become less reliant on the properties or the rights holders to be providing data to justify that value. There may be some collaboration there, but from what we're seeing, that brands want to control the measurement side of things and just understand, is it working or not. There's at least on the athlete side, and you're seeing it a little bit with some of the bigger brands like InBev, where there's this desire to move towards performance-based sponsorships, because there's and that really speaks to the accountability question is, how can we keep people more accountable, and we want to pay for performance, not for intangibles. So that's absolutely starting, and it is getting built into a lot of athlete agreements that we're seeing, and it's really not just performance based; it's really incentive based. So let's reward people for doing a better job. And then again, yeah, just social is now. There's still some brands that don't have social as a deliverable or a component of their sponsorship agreements, and now we're seeing every brand that we work with has social built into their sponsorship contracts now. So there's an expectation and there's deliverables that are required. And it is, there's a reason why it's kind of the number one, sponsorship benefit, or number two behind category exclusivity. But yeah, there's a reason why, is because it's just so powerful, and it's something that brands can control and affect the outcome of.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much, Scott.
Yeah, thank you, Owen. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Anytime.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.